Now, you may be asking, what is generational trauma? Before we get into that, you need to understand what trauma itself is. According to Natalie Boone from Ensemble Therapy, trauma is an experience that happens to an individual's life that creates serious harm, whether that be mentally, physically, emotionally, or even sexual harm. Trauma can happen at any point in a person's life, and that impact of that trauma varies from each individual. Now, take what we've gathered from trauma and spread it over a series of generations, and you get generational trauma, which can be described as a traumatic event that began decades prior to the current generation. Sometimes it doesn't even have to occur decades prior, it can happen a generation before, or if you were the grandchild, it would happen to your grandparent. And it doesn't have to be a certain event, it can also be a certain behavior. This brings us into our next topic, which answers the question, why is it so significant? Generational trauma is so significant because it affects the future generations' mindsets, such as how they view, understand, and cope with certain situations later in life. This mindset is kept within the family for such a long time that it becomes normalized. This normalization of trauma causes the family to view the problem as insignificant or non important. Some even turn a blind eye to the traumatic habits formed that they don't even talk about it anymore. For example, Dr. Fabiana Franco from Psych Central explains that normalized traumatic behaviors repeat and cause damage, and how these normalized behaviors create a highly toxic and undamaging and damaging emotional atmosphere within familial interactions and households. I've seen and experienced firsthand how toxic these behaviors can be, especially to a young child, and I know that I'm not the only one who has experienced these things. This brings us to the symptoms slash signs of generational trauma within an individual and an entire household. However, I would like to emphasize that not every family has the same signs or show the same symptoms, because each person has different trauma responses and experience different types of trauma. Throughout my research on this project, I realized two things. The first is the similarities of the symptoms and signs within each article, such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, which is post traumatic stress disorder, mistrust, and issues with self esteem or self confidence. These are the most common mental illnesses that derive from generational trauma, and these are called trauma responses, which is a way that a person copes with what they have traumatically experienced. On the other hand, we have the signs of a family experiencing generational trauma, and this can be completely different or very similar to how an individual experiences trauma or responds to trauma. And these can be shown as truant children, being emotionally numb, have trust issues, being anxious or overly protective of other family members. And these are signs of generational trauma within families. And this isn't how they act with each other. This is how they seem to outsiders or anyone other than who they are abusing. Now, we have examples of generational trauma. Again, I do want to emphasize that the ones listed are not the only forms of trauma. They are just examples shown to help you further understand why generational trauma is. The first example of generational trauma is that of Holocaust survivors. And this is an account from an interviewee from the website Hello Giggles. This person, whose name is David Ruff, explains that his grandmother is a Holocaust survivor and how her behaviors and cautions from after the event was passed on to her children and even grandchildren. He describes feeling indescribably anxious and stressed every day of his life. He also explains that some of his fears and anxieties are like that of his grandmother. It's like his grandmother unintentionally transferred her fears from the traumatic event that she went through decades late earlier to her children and grandchildren. And said family members now live with the constant fear of the unknown. This is a clear example of generational trauma that has been passed down from Muff's grandmother to himself. Another example is one that is more uncomfortable for most people to hear, but I bring it up because it is so incredibly common that it is no longer viewed as a bad thing within certain families. And that is of non consensual incest between a young child and an older family member. This is an example of generational trauma because, as I've said before, some families sweep certain things under the rug or just turn a blind eye, which in turn allows the trauma to continue. A child who is molested at a young age by an older family member or friend is one of those things. Now, this child is most likely to do one of three things. The first is doing the same to another child as an adult. The second is transferring the negative feelings and self guilt onto their own future children. And the third is being so overprotective of their siblings, cousins, or even future children to prevent the same thing from happening to them. The first two options listed continue the cycle of trauma for future generations, while the third is a form of breaking the cycle. Now, this leads us to the final topic, which is how generational trauma can be stopped or prevented. There are many ways generational trauma can be prevented or stopped for future generations. According to Elizabeth Dixon of Psychology Today, generational trauma can be prevented by talking to your children or siblings about your experiences and feelings so that a weight of some sort can be lifted from their shoulders. I personally believe that this option does not help because it may worsen their feelings or anxieties, and but everyone reacts differently. Another way that the cycle can be stopped is by getting help from your traumas and experiences so that you don't force the burden onto your future family. I think that this is the best method because you are working through your trauma, learning your triggers and unwinding why you are the way you are, which may help in the long run.